Huh. Okay. Well, I was trying to, hello, this is Danny Haiphong. You are tuning into the Left Lens, and we're trying to get onto Twitter as well. But it's not letting us right now, so that's perfectly fine. But we are on YouTube, and let's just confirm that, guys, if any one of you guys can pull it up, just because
I don't.
a lot of people have been having issues with you. We are? All right, cool. All right, so a lot of people have been having issues with YouTube, especially journalists and activists, especially since the January 6th Capitol Hill riot and the fallout from that. So, but we're here. All right, folks are saying everything looks good. So yeah, we are here with a special episode, a special live episode of The Left Lens. We're with our good comrade Ajamu Baraka, who is national organizer with the Black Alliance for Peace. He is also an editor at Black Agenda Report, and he ran on the Green Party ticket with Jill Stein as vice president of her campaign, and really brought a lot to it from a revolutionary perspective. But today is Martin Luther King Day, and his birthday passed a few days ago, but it is observed in the United States today. And there's a lot to talk about with Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy, how it's been whitewashed in many ways by the corporate media, by the political establishment, even and especially the Black political establishment in DC and basically anywhere, everywhere. But I wanted to just throw it over to Ajamu Baraka. Could you tell us what about Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is so important for right now in this moment? Everyone's talking about the Capitol Hill riot. Everyone is talking about the election, and Joe Biden is going to be inaugurated in just a few days. So what's important to remember about Martin Luther King now as we enter this, as we continue along this struggle against this chaotic and crisis-ridden American empire?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, let me thank the both of you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. This is one of the most exciting new shows that have come out recently, so I'm really glad to be here. We have to every year, we have to engage in this conversation around the legacy and the meaning of Dr. King. And we have to do that because of the way in which the King ideal has been appropriated by the state for its own purposes. The first thing that we have to always remind people of is the fact that you can't understand Dr. King, the person, if you abstract him from the movement that created Dr. King. Dr. King didn't just come out of thin air. He wasn't some savior that came down to save the people. Dr. King was a product of the movement. He was invited, in fact, into the movement in Montgomery, Alabama. It was the people around Dr. King who was part of that movement that created the energy, created the momentum, created the structures, the institutions that, along with SNCC and CORE and other formations, made up the so-called Black freedom movement in the South. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we want to remind people also too that even though the state has sanitized, whitewashed Dr. King, made him a part of their grand story of progress, we remind people that when Dr. King was murdered on April the 4th, 1968, he was probably one of the most hated individuals in the country. Now, Black people still love Dr. King. A lot of other people love Dr. King, even though there was a serious critique of him and his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But when Dr. King made his break on April the 4th, 1967, break from the Democrat Party, and came out in opposition to the Vietnam War and started organizing Poor People's Campaign. He received extensive criticism from his supporters, from people even within his own organization, from the administration, the Democrat administration, the Democrat Party, from the right. Um, and he was seen as a traitor, turncoat, and that really provided created the conditions that made him politically vulnerable for his eventual execution. People were really upset too with the notion, in particular the administration, the Johnson administration, of him organizing poor people to come to the Capitol, organizing poor people, raising economic issues, as opposed to the lane that was given to him, which was supposed to be just political civil rights. And so all of these factors came together to make him vulnerable, and ended up with him losing his life. So we have to recapture this history and use that as a foundation to talk about what Dr. King meant, where he was situated within the broader Black liberation movement, and what might be his value for understanding the conditions and the circumstances and issues we are facing today.
You know, it's funny, Ajamu. It's how many years later now? 50 some odd years later, since he was assassinated. Since that day in 1967, a year to the day that he was assassinated, when he gave that speech and unequivocally denounced the war in Vietnam, and speak of the break he made with the Democratic Party. And here we are in the 21st century, in 2021, still struggling with this issue. King's, as you say, his associates, his own father, told him that he was foolish to break with Lyndon Johnson. And today we have a movement which is not what it was then, and people are still afraid to break from the Democratic Party, which is by many different measures worse than it was then. And it seems the attachment, though, is stronger. Can you speak to that issue we're still facing now?
Well, yes, and one of the things that he said in 1967 that we're still grappling with today is when he identified the U.S. as the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet. Mm-hmm. So that issue of U.S. violence and the connection that he made with U.S. violence, with the philosophy of materialism that's at the heart of capitalism, and the means by which the U.S. was able to maintain its hegemony, both, of course, in the U.S. and globally. Militarism, those connections he made, are still what we are grappling with today as we try to revive an anti-war and anti-imperialist movement in this country today. So this, the kinds of issues that King was articulating, and the kinds of issues that other organizations were articulating at that time in 1968, were the issues that had emerged as the main contradictions that not only Black people had to deal with, but also people in the US and people globally. That when he came out in opposition to the Vietnam War, it was a statement of anti-imperialism. And it for the first time put him on the right side of history. He talked about at Riverside that the nation and the people had to get on the right side of the world revolution. And in fact, a world revolution was in fact unfolding. 1968 was a key year in those struggles. So, what we saw from 1968 to today was the defeat of many of the progressive movements, the assault on the Black liberation movement, the more militant wing of it, the dismantlement of our most effective organizations, But those elements he talked about, the continuation of militarism, of materialism, um, they are still with us today, and they really define the politics of today, especially after the U.S. made its turn to neoliberalism, really beginning in the 1970s, and the way those contradictions have intensified up to this present moment, with the emergence now of a pretty aggressive right-wing movement that sort of approximates the activities and behaviors we associate with the Nazi movement of the 1930s. So, you know, there's a continuation because the conditions have continued. The contradictory conditions of this capitalist colonial project.
Yeah, definitely. All of those are very good points. Before I move on, please hit the like and the share button and subscribe and hit the bell. Please spread the word about the stream, and then also spread the word about the channel as we continue to try to get around these algorithms as best we can. But as you were saying, Martin Luther King Jr., I mean, I was rereading his Beyond Vietnam speech over the last few days, and what is so striking about it is that he was giving a warning at that time, and this is often ignored by people who remember Martin Luther King and our mainstream institutions within this imperialist system. But he was giving a warning that if people did not stand up against imperialism abroad and connect it to the exploitation of the poor and the working class and to the oppression of Black people, then we would be having this conversation over and over and over again in varying contexts, whether it was Vietnam one day or Colombia the next day or Ghana the next. So he was giving a warning about this, and his warning came true. The American empire is much bigger than it was in 1968 in terms of its scope, in terms of how much money is put into it by the United States government, in terms of how destructive it is around the world and its capacity and capabilities of destruction, and in terms of this in the time he was living through. You said it, Ajamu, you said that he was talking about the world revolution, and the world revolution was indeed happening, and he was looking at what the Vietnamese people were doing. He was looking at what the people of Latin America and Venezuela and Cuba were doing. He visited Ghana long before he died. He visited Ghana during their independence celebration and met with Kwame Nkrumah before he was considered some internationalist at that time. So he was a product, of course, of a different period that we're going through. But now we are seeing the fruits of what it means for Martin Luther King Jr.'s true legacy to be suppressed. We're seeing the American empire running wild and now getting into dangerous confrontations with big powers like China and Russia. And for me, Martin Luther King Jr. really reflects, I think, work that you've been doing a lot, Ajamu. I know Margaret's been a part of it. We've all been part of it, this people-centered human rights framework. I feel like Black Alliance for Peace is a manifestation of King's legacy as well. But, in my opinion, the sanitization and the suppression of King has really helped cement the hegemony of American empire and, of course, the ideological hegemony of American exceptionalism, which says that Martin Luther King Jr. was just talking about a dream. He was just talking about a dream of Black people being equal in the United States. And that really wasn't what Martin Luther King Jr. was ever talking about, but definitely not by the end of his life. He was talking about a revolution in values, and he was imploring people in the United States to see the people of Vietnam as their brothers, to see the people of the world as their equals in order to stop this anti-communist campaign, which was costing at that time millions of lives, both Vietnamese and American, and he was educating people about what was happening all over the world. So I think it's just so instructive to remember his true legacy right now.
You're absolutely right, and it's unfortunate that well, actually, it is instructive in the sense that uh, we have to remember that Dr. King's break with the Democratic Party was an important one, but it wasn't the first one to take place among the Black liberation elements. A number of our organizations, in particular groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of course, the Black Panther Party, Revolutionary Action Movement, had already expressed their opposition to the Vietnamese, to the Vietnam War, and expressed their solidarity with the Vietnamese people. In fact, many of the individuals who ended up emerging as some of the stars, if you will, of the anti-war movement were in fact trained by SNCC in the South. So in some ways, Dr. King was sort of catching up with the dominant trends. We have to remember too that in that uh, Dr. King's tendency was in fact a moderate tendency those days. Okay, and it's just reflective of the kind of politics that were in play. So the attempt by the state to re, to reinvent Dr. King was all part of the counter-revolutionary and counterinsurgency that was directed at the Black Liberation Movement that really intensified after they murdered Dr. King and after they murdered Fred Hampton and Mark Clark and other Black Panthers and other revolutionaries across this country. We suffered a multi-pronged attack that had both a military component, but more importantly, an ideological component. The military component was to basically dismantle our organizations, to drive people underground, to imprison people, to drive people out the country, and they were largely successful at that. The ideological component was to create the ideological conditions, the cultural conditions, to try to ensure that another generation that emerged in the 1960s and early 70s would never emerge again. I call it the Americanization of the African in the 1970s. And the culmination of that process of attempting to shift consciousness to make us part of the American empire, if you will, culminated with the ascendancy to power of Barack Hussein Obama. So that is the
Ajamu, I think your internet is having some delays.
The Dr. King deification, and I disappeared, and then Margaret disappeared. Okay, so you're back.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah.
We're on back.
The internet or some other forces. So this is all part of the process of the Americanization of the African, the way in which they used the legacy of Dr. King and the kind of lessons that they were successful in advancing, especially the notion that Dr. King was someone that could be understood outside of the context of our movement.
You know, Ajamu, it's interesting what you've said. I agree with everything you have said. How do we keep from feeling defeatist? As you point out, you pointed out how there was solid international solidarity. Black Americans in particular, even before King made his break, we always questioned U.S. foreign policy. If any group of people was going to feel solidarity with the Vietnamese, it was going to be us. And as you say that, and not by accident, but by design, that relationship has been broken. How do we move forward with optimism. I mean, you have to be optimistic. We have to be positive about our movement. Can you tell us your thoughts about how we both acknowledge these things that have happened in the past, but make sure that we still have the desire to move and the inclination to move ahead?
Mhm. You know, one thing that's instructive about history is that not only is it instructive, but it can be inspirational in the sense that when we either see or go through experiences where we see the potential power of the people, then that is an experience that it never leaves many of us. There's a reason, Margaret, why I think that when you go to some of these events, anti-war, anti-imperialist events, you see so many of us with gray hair,
Yeah.
and then there's a big gap between us and the few young people who are sprinkled. And the question always becomes, why are so many of these old folks still involved in this struggle? And I tell people, I think that the main reason for that is because we truly understood, because we had a chance to experience it, the power of the people, the optimism of the moment. We absolutely believe that we could defeat this system and build a new society and a new world. And now some people fail to decide, no question about that. But for those of us who had that feeling, had those experiences, that is what keeps you going because you understand what, in fact, can be put in place. So what we have, that's why it's so important for us to reclaim Dr. King and resituate him in our movement as a product of our movement. We understood that it is through organization, the persistent, systematic building of organized resistance that can result in winning concessions from a more powerful opposition, like what we did, and can result in creating real power among our folks and a real sense of optimism that we, in fact, can go forward and build a new world. So the way we look at this, Margaret, is to see what happened, to properly assess the forces that moved against us, that resulted in these temporary defeats, uh, uh, but to also put in place, as we build new formations, a strategy that will help us to avoid the defeats that we suffered before. But what drives us is our understanding that the organized people that are conscious, really, it sounds like a cliche, but they really cannot be defeated. That's when we make fundamental changes. And even as we face the conditions we are facing today, in the midst of the most critical, the deepest crisis that the capitalist system has ever really gone through or experienced, including the so-called Great Depression, I feel great optimism because look at the kinds of young people who are coming into the ranks of the Black Alliance for Peace, for example.
Yeah.
Young people who are looking for answers, but who are already committed to an idea that we, in fact, can organize ourselves and make real radical change. So the history of struggles, not only in this country but globally, that's what keeps the optimism. That's what keeps us from becoming demoralized. We know that, in fact, we, as Dr. King said, that we are, in fact, on the right side of history.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's all very true. And to go back to something you said earlier, Ajamu, you talking about King kind of catching up. And I think it poses a big lesson for us now because right now the entire left, the entire working class in the United States, the entire, oppressed people, the Black movement, it's all now, right now we are now catching up to the conditions of the time. We're in a different situation, and while it may not have the same prospects as maybe during King's period, there was still, and we have to look at this objectively, there was so much chaos, there was so much uncertainty, and also there were so many there were setbacks as there were victories as well. So I think, right now, what's so important is to look back at the real Dr. Martin Luther King, and also look back at the real contradictions that existed in that period, the entirety of the movement, not just one person. I feel like one thing that happens in the United States is that there is this, because the ruling class has centered one person over many others, we do forget about the entire movement and how King was playing catch up, because organizations like SNCC, like the Black Panther Party, like RAM, like so many were really acting as the vanguard at that period. In that period, I think Dr. Martin Luther King was really finding himself really humbled by how fast the world was moving beyond what he had imagined would be the case. Even in Beyond Vietnam, I was reading, he was talking about nonviolence, and he was talking about how the only way nonviolence is going to occur if the United States stops the violence. But there had been people for years and years and years, especially in the Black movement, saying, well, the violence of the United States is endemic and inherent, and it won't stop unless it is met with force, if it's met with a struggle for power. And that debate was happening and raging as King was doing his work. So I think right now we need to spark these kind of debates. We need to be in these organizations. We need to support organizations like Black Alliance for Peace and begin having these debates in the here and now, because there's so many critical issues, and maybe we can transition here to the here and now. So many important critical struggles. The U.S. is on a new Cold War footing with China. The Capitol Hill riot has everyone talking about censorship versus white nationalism, and I think so many sides are getting this wrong, especially when it comes to the elite narrative about this thing. But I mean, we are going through a pandemic and a world economic crisis, and now Joe Biden is coming into office. There's so much transition happening, and I think people are feeling a little hopeless because the times are so dire. But the optimism, I think what you were saying, is that there is so much history and legacy and struggle that has occurred up until this point, that we have so much we can learn from, and then we can employ it in the things that we do right now, whatever our role in it will be. But yeah, maybe we can transition to this current moment, because I think this current moment has a lot of very pertinent and very dire issues that need to be addressed and talked about in a different way, which I think Martin Luther King was trying to do when he was alive.
Exactly. I think that one of the things that, as we make this transition to the current moment, that we remind ourselves of, is that we made many mistakes. And one major mistake that we made in our optimism and some maybe sort of naivete, was we didn't understand the extent to which the system was able to make reforms, to incorporate elements of our movement, to confuse people, to make adjustments. We thought that we had a critique that suggested that the crisis was going to intensify, and that it was going to lead to the kind of radical change we thought was right around the corner. Neoliberalism that started to emerge in the 1970s was basically part of that counter-revolutionary momentum. Neoliberalism, properly understood, has to be seen as the rebellion of capital. The rebellion of capital against the post-war hegemonic economic philosophy and governmental philosophy of Keynesianism. So part of the counter-revolutionary thrust in the 1970s was to reintroduce the classical capitalist economics and to reimpose the rule of capital, to discipline the working classes, to attack and to undermine radical politics. So that move in the 1970s to what we refer to as neoliberalism and globalization, set the stage for today. It set the stage for the rise of Trump, because with over 40 years of neoliberal policies, it created the conditions, the frustrations, the anger, the radical individualism, the bloated state in the service of capital that created the conditions that brought Trump to power. You can't understand Trump unless you understand those conditions, including the collapse of 2007 and 2008, and the inability of the system to rebound in a way that really addressed the material contradictions of neoliberalism. That didn't happen, and as a consequence, Trump rode to power even after he was created as the optimal candidate that the Clinton campaign wanted, but because they didn't understand the conditions that people were facing. And we saw it when I was on the Green Party campaign stump. People who were always telling me in jail, they talk about this economic recovery and the things are better, but where are things better? I don't feel it in my life and in the life of my family. And we were seeing the conditions around the country, and we knew something was up. And that's why we knew something was up, because of so many people who were coming to our campaign. Now, in the end, they didn't end up voting for us, but we had that alternative set of debates that the Democracy Now! Did for us. We had 28 million people who watched those debates. When CNN did the town hall meeting with us, we had 26 million people who watched that. The last few weeks of October, before the election, when normally for a third party candidacy, you feel the dissipation of energy. We weren't seeing that. We were having functions. I had a function in Mississippi and in Jackson State. It was a last minute thing we threw together. We had 100 people in the audience, but it was watched by 365,000 people. Those are the kind of numbers we're pulling. I ended up in Detroit 4 days before the election, on the same day that Tim Kaine, the vice presidential candidate for Hillary Clinton. And guess who was drawing the biggest crowds? So the people understood that something was up. Now, in the end, they went for the Democrats out of issues of pragmatism and all of that. But my point is this: there's something ripe in this country for a alternative politics. Part of that rightness, if you will, is being manifested in the right-wing populism we see grouped around Donald Trump. And there's 75 million people who voted for him. But on the other side, there's something potential there too, with the 80 million people who voted against Donald Trump and not necessarily for Joe Biden. But many of those millions of people are looking for something different than the neoliberalism that they're going to get with Joe Biden. And that's where the optimism is, that we can build something that's really alternative, that really would take us further than the limitations of the neoliberal project that we know the Democrats are going to reintroduce in the next few days.
Yes, it's we know that's going to happen. Inauguration Day is just a couple of days from now, a very strange inauguration. In the wake of the Capitol Hill riot, where Washington, D.C. is on lockdown by the National Guard. Yet at the same time, people are so happy to be rid of Trump that Joe Biden is unfortunately seen as some kind of a savior. And as you said, we know what we're going to get. He said so. He told a group of wealthy donors, nothing will fundamentally change. So he said it himself. There's no reason for the rest of us to guess. Um, but as we move forward, as you were just saying, people's lives are even worse now in the wake of the COVID epidemic, which was not just a health crisis, but which created an economic crisis, which has exposed this system of neoliberalism that is devoted to making sure that people's lives are as precarious as possible. We haven't talked about last summer, though, the protests that emerged around the country after George Floyd was killed by police in Minneapolis. It was huge. There were millions of people all across the country. I think the election dissipated a lot of that energy. But I don't believe it disappeared. The conditions have only gotten worse. We're being told that we might get $2,000, one-time payment of $2,000 to suffering people, which is now $1,400, not $2,000. So, and that's where the optimism comes in for me, to see that people responded the way that they did. But there were mistakes there as well. And I was wondering if you can talk about what those were, how to avoid them, and how to rekindle, because I don't believe millions of people came out just because George Floyd was killed. I believe people were feeling all the insecurity, all the things that you mentioned, all came together. So, what are your thoughts on reviving that momentum and avoiding some of the errors that were made?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Margaret, that many people who went to the streets last year, they of course they were motivated by the snuff film that we saw of George Floyd, but they were also motivated by a sense of frustration, of anger, a sense that none of our lives really meant much to the authorities. Because around that same time, in the latter part of May, we saw how the capitalists were finding ways to try to drive people back to work, even though people didn't have PPE. They were so concerned about the plight of the economy that they exposed the fact that they really didn't care about the health of the people. And that message was something that people felt. So the murder of George Floyd was almost in a sense of sort of a metaphor for the assault that all of them were feeling, and this sense of outrage and the desire to fight back. And I think that's why people fought back and fought back so ferociously. I mean, folks burnt down a police station in Minneapolis. I mean, this was a militant response, okay? And I think because of the militancy of it, that is why the authorities, the state, the ruling class had to try to make sure that they could try to control it some kind of way and change its character to prevent it from moving from a outrage against for George Floyd to something similar to what we saw in France. When the yellow vest came out, the objectives were relatively limited and ended up being a general rebellion against neoliberal policies. And the way they wanted to try to manage that in the U.S. was when is by flooding the movement with all this money, placing this organization we refer to as Black Lives Matter, which is really a fictitious organization. The Black Lives Matter exists in various locales, okay? But what they did was take the notion of Black Lives Matter and place them on top of something that they really didn't have a whole lot to do with. These were spontaneous reactions, spontaneous rebellions. Of course, they said Black Lives Matter because that's the only slogan people really had at that moment. Okay. But what they wanted to do, the rulers, was to make sure that rebellion stayed at the sort of amorphous level of the demand for something called racial justice or criminal justice reform, and not make that pivot to a general critique and opposition to the system. They disconnected the notion of racial justice from economic justice. We talked about that within the context of a Black Agenda report. You know, a number of people talked about that, how that disconnection took place. That was conscious. Okay, they created the myth of the good protesters versus the bad protesters. Okay, you know, they talked about the outside agitators who are white, because one of the things that really freaked them out was the multiracial, multinational character of these political activities. That's the biggest fear that the rulers have in this country, is for that kind of connection to be made and to be expressed in a political movement. So all of these things came together to basically undermine that energy and to keep it directed in channels that could be easily absorbed by the system. And that's what happened. You know, then they floated out. They unleashed this campaign, this defund the police campaign, and that was an element of that takes you from really the streets to negotiations with various local authorities and you engage in this kind of bureaucratic struggle around funding. Okay, where the funds go, and the critical element of who controls the police, the role of the police, the state, all that gets sort of pushed to the side. So yes, this is what we have to deal with. And today, we see that energy has kind of dissipated because, like you said, Margaret, some kind of way, these localized struggles and this sort of general call for racial justice got colonized by the Democratic Party and got translated into an anti-Trump movement. Mm. So people say, Black Lives Matter, please go out and vote.
Yeah. No, and to add to that, I mean, the Black Lives Matter, I was actually checking out the Black Lives Matter global network website recently because I wanted to just check out what they were doing. One of the big campaigns they had was the Get Out the Vote in Georgia. So that's just a very concrete manifestation of this. And Black Agenda Report has been talking about this since the uprising in Ferguson and the formation of this kind of Black Lives Matter banner, which does, as you said, has this fictitious organization, which really is just a stream of funds at this point. It's a big nonprofit, and it kind of takes money from wherever. We don't know. We know some, maybe Google, others, but it's very non-transparent, and it has played a big role in this spontaneous uprising. It happened in 2014, 15 too. They come in and they're the legitimate activists, right? Not the black activists throwing back tear canisters as they were in Ferguson, not those who are burning the Minneapolis police department down in Minneapolis during the rebellion this summer, but it's these kind of nonprofit activists who are really attached to the Democratic Party, and this has been a long phenomenon. It's not new. There's a great book I always recommend to people if they want to hear about the kind of the formation of these foundations and the role that they play in the counterinsurgency that you've been talking about, Ajamu, and you too, Margaret, about called Black Awakening in Capitalist America by Robert Allen. I mean, this was happening in the 60s as well. A lot of mainstream organizations were receiving Ford Foundation funding, and it did have a direct impact on the ideological direction of the Black movement, and it created a fissure within it, and these divides between the radical elements versus the more streets to the suites, as Glenn Ford says all the time in his articles. This phenomenon of taking the movement from the streets and putting it into the mainstream of society. So now that Joe Biden can kind of label himself as a Black Lives Matter presidency because he has the Congressional Black Caucus on his side, and the Democratic Party can kneel inside of Capitol Hill and kente cloth, all this kind of stuff. That's how you try to co-opt the movement. But the conditions don't change, and I think that even though things have settled down, we've seen numerous Black people get killed by the police even recently, and we know that Joe Biden is he's no Barack Obama. So I think that there is this moment now where, and maybe we can also transition to the international component in our last 15 minutes. There is this component now where this crisis that the system is facing, while it does have this ability to reform, as you said, Ajamu, that there was this underestimation over the last 40 years of how much the society and the social system of imperialism could absorb elements of the movement and also make certain changes, even in language and stature, and giving folks certain access to city councils, congressional seats, whatever it may be. But what we see after all of that is conditions have gotten really bad. I mean, it's right now we're in this moment where the United States is on a precipitous decline, and Joe Biden is not going to reorient that. The best he can do is try to reorient it maybe ideologically, but even so, that creates more schisms, because the reality, Trump at least was a reflection of reality in a lot of ways. He was a reflection of the chaos. He's a reflection of the white supremacy. He's a reflection of capitalist rule. Joe Biden's existence, his presence, and his administration, I believe, will sow further conditions that will reflect an reality, an alienation, so to speak, that has its own set of dangers. So I don't know if we want to if you have anything to say about that, but that's sort of what was coming to mind when you were speaking.
Well, I mean, as we make the transition to the connection with the international, I want to make sure that no one misinterprets what I'm saying in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. There are real militant elements who are involved in that movement. A lot of serious and committed young folks who went to the streets, who were committed to trying to bring about some kind of change. And that's important for us to acknowledge. And they learned some lessons too as a consequence. But what we have to also acknowledge is that the political potential of that movement was in fact undermined because it never did gel into a truly national radical movement. It got stuck at the level of reform. And this just was a reflection of the political and ideological challenges we have in trying to rebuild an effective radical movement among Black folks and broadly in this country. So, I want to make sure that people understand that it's not a critique of the people who are in the streets, many of them who sacrifice, but a critique of how those kinds of motions can be co-opted by the movement. They, in fact, can be used to legitimize the state. When you talk about the possibility of justice, that you are suggesting in a way, you're implying in a way, that the settler colonial state has the ability to, in fact, give you justice, that it has the legitimacy to give justice. And that we know is a myth, just like the whole notion of the confusion around the role of the police. The police are not going to be voluntarily disbanded, because the police are the front line in the protection of the state. And you're not going to get rid of the police until you fundamentally transform the nature of this state. So these are all the kind of things we have to talk about and get clear about as we construct a radical movement here in this country. And the other thing we have to get clear about too is that what we are facing in the US cannot be understood and cannot be defeated in abstraction from the global nature of what we are facing. We're just involved in the national expression of a global system Well, so when we talk about capitalism, we're not talking about you're not talking about U.S. capitalism like there's something separate from European capitalism or capitalism in Brazil. There are some specific national expressions, but we're talking about the hegemony of a global system. And from our point of view, we talk about the colonial capitalist system that emerged when Europe spilled out of Europe in 1492. It became the predominant global system that defines what we refer to as modernization. So, we've got to understand that there's no freedom in the U.S. without defeating global capital. Okay, and so those are the lessons we have to learn. When we learn that, then we understand why it's so vitally important for us to be in solidarity with the people who are fighting for liberation in various parts of the global system. That you cannot is a contradiction, a moral and a political contradiction for people to pretend to be radicals in the US and that's say a mumbling word about US criminality in Venezuela, in Iran, in North Korea, in China, around surrounding China. It's a contradiction that we've got to address. So these are some of the things we have to do in terms of making those kind of connections and centering the internationalist worldview, because we are part of a collective humanity. And the capitalist rulers want to keep us divided. They want to keep us in competition with one another. They want to keep us connected to our own pathetic little national states. When the real struggle is for us to liberate ourselves from this global system, to understand that, if we don't deal with climate change, we all are going to die. If we allow these freaks who are openly articulated the possibility of a nuclear first strike, if there's a nuclear exchange, all of us die. Okay. So these issues are not some kind of exotic kind of add-on to your real issues. If you're not talking about militarism, like Dr. King and we and us as a peace movement, as an anti-imperialist movement, if you're not making the connection between anti-imperialism and the police forces cracking your heads in Detroit and Chicago and Atlanta, then you're missing the boat. And in fact, you are propping up the very system you claim to be opposed to.
That's so true. And this need for internationalism is especially an international point of view, this need for international solidarity. We can see it very easily here where the military budget, more than $700 billion, is 60% of discretionary spending in this country. It's literally why Americans can't have nice things. Anything that you mentioned that Americans need, healthcare, housing, education, infrastructure, all of it is lacking because of the military industrial complex. And that is one of the reasons I'm so proud to be affiliated with Black Alliance for Peace, because we make this very clear connection at this moment when the world is facing so many challenges. And I wanted to ask about COVID specifically, because I think it exposed so much about the issues you've mentioned, that the United States, I think we've reached or will reach within the next couple of days 400,000 deaths from COVID here, millions of deaths around the world, but China has 5,000. I think I'm rounding up, in fact. I think it's even less than that. So we can make, or should be making, this connection with this, what began as a health crisis and is still a health crisis and has exposed our lack of a real healthcare system. We have a non-system healthcare system. And on top of it all, this failure to do testing, the failure to care for people. Now they are pushing this vaccine on people. And I'm not saying people should not take it. I understand the desire, I understand the need for it. But even this vaccine rollout, obviously the same people who presided over this catastrophe are presiding over this vaccine rollout, which in itself exposes so much about this country and about the capitalist system. And Trump was blamed for so much. It's all just Trump. And now that Biden's in, everything people say, it's all going to, all these problems will disappear. But the system isn't changing. So I don't see that happening. What are your thoughts on that?
It's not going to change. And Trump, because he couldn't get himself out of the way, ended up being the fall guy for the failures and the contradictions of the capitalist order. When they depended on the private sector to basically save them, that was the first mistake. When people were saying the only way the U.S. would be able to deal with this pandemic would be to, in essence, nationalize the healthcare delivery system. One. Secondly, to have a process of, if you're going to have a vaccine, it has to be something that's going to be under the public control. And that you have to do that in cooperation with other nations so that you can have something that, one, can be effective, and secondly, can be used throughout the entire globe. But none of that happened because of their ideological commitment to the private sector and the private capitalism. But in the meantime, the people got a master class in how little their lives meant to the rulers. They also got a master class in the failures of this economic order. And the very fact that it's going to get even worse portends the kind of social disarray and uncertainty and instability that we are going to face in the United States of America. And lastly, they cannot avoid the comparisons that people are in fact making between the failures of capitalism to protect the fundamental human rights of its own citizens and residents and what happened in China and other countries. And how do you explain that? Well, you have to look at two different kinds of systems. You have to start raising some critical questions about how these two societies have organized themselves. What are the critical values that are in play? What's missing here in the U.S. That might help to explain the kind of critical circumstances we are facing here in this country, people dying by the droves every day. You know, these are all the issues that people have to really grapple with. One quick thing though, one of the last thing on this COVID thing, in terms of the domestic piece, as we move to the international in the last couple of minutes. 50,000 Black people died. It's estimated. But, you know, the whole Black Lives Matter thing with the killings by police was targeted on police killings. And that's understandable. But how many, in raw numbers, how many Black folks are murdered every year by the police? It's something like 23% or 23 to 25%, which comes to about 250 people a year. Why is it that the 50,000 unnecessary COVID deaths of Black folks didn't get translated into a racial justice issue? Why are we more outraged by that than this continued focus on this issue of police violence, as important as that is also? Okay, so these are some of the ways in which the state and the ruling class is able to manipulate and to confuse people so that we don't get a chance to realize our full political potential. And these are the kind of things we've got to grapple with, because with the fiscal crisis that's going to emerge in the next few months, with the evictions that will happen, with the unemployment that will continue and get worse, we've got to understand that Black folks are not going to just allow them, they're not going to just lay back and just allow themselves to die. And we are the ones who are going to be disproportionately impacted by this, because we occupy the lowest rungs of the labor force. We are the ones that are, in essence, redundant. So things will get worse before they get better. But the only way they get better is when we understand what we're up against and prepare our forces to be able to resist and to advance our forces when we can, toward the kind of objectives we've got to move toward to save ourselves.
Yeah. We're coming close to the end of the hour. I'll definitely, if anyone has last words, for sure, Ajamu and Margaret, please feel free to jump in afterwards. But I think this was a really great conversation. We hit on a lot in the hour. I will say, I really, this is a really interesting point that you brought up, Ajamu, about the kind of normalization of Black death around COVID-19 versus police brutality, police lynching. And, you know, it's very interesting because I do think that, you know, one of the ways in which this movement for Black lives, this anti-police brutality movement has been shaped, I think the narrative has been shaped by elite forces, by the media, by some of these counter-revolutionary forces that are intermixing with the spontaneous uprising. Is there's something very visceral and easily manipulated when you're talking about the police and its relationship to Black people. Not a lot of people know the history. And then there's this idea that uh, police violence is such a brutal expression of how Black people are in fact not citizens, and in fact the goal for Black people is to ultimately become citizens and to be treated like Americans too. So there's this assumption that this is the most extreme form of how this takes place, this second class citizenship status for Black people in the modern era, in the post civil rights era. And it really falls into this American exceptionalist ethos of, well, these other things that happen to Black people, right? This the fact that Black men in the United States have a life expectancy, I think that's like 15, 16, 17, 18 years less than Beijing. And Beijing was an underdeveloped city like just 30 years ago. But yet people in Beijing live 15, 16, 17, 18 years more than Black men in the United States, the so-called richest and most civilized country in the world. And you know, the health disparities, the segregation in the cities, the defunding of the schools, the privatization, the austerity, all of it targets Black people the most and relegates them to so many kinds of forms of premature death that often do not get mixed in. And then we look at this movement for like Medicare for all, for example, or a Green New Deal. No one's talking about the role that Black people will have to play in this, and the leadership of the Black movement in these struggles, which is historic on its face as well. But oftentimes these things are separated, right? The condition of Black people, their struggles, and struggles for these more universal kind of more class-oriented demands. And I think it just goes to show how much I think the narrative has been manipulated around these issues to make it fall conveniently within how the U.S. Empire, the ruling class, how they want to deal with these kind of struggles. They want to see everybody kind of in their own lanes and negating race or negating class. They don't want to see any kind of unification of these very critical concepts that basically shape human life in the United States and around the world. And then, you know, to a past comment that you also made about what the United States does around the world, and Margaret, to echo you too, it's like there's so much investment in empire in the United States, but it's also the kind of, when you look at the particularities of that investment, for example, the way the U.S. supported the right-wing Hong Kong protesters, or the right-wing opposition in Venezuela or Nicaragua. We could go down the line, the right-wing jihadists in Syria and in Libya and all over the world. That's a manifestation of this international white supremacist system, that it shouldn't be a surprise, because the origins of that come from the United States. When you see something like the Capitol Hill riot and you see them chanting for Hong Kong and against China and talking about how Joe Biden is a communist and Kamala Harris is a communist, that right-wing, those right-wing roots are still embedded in the United States, and actually more so than ever. If Trump wasn't an indication of that, and now Joe Biden, we are still dealing with this international system of white supremacy, which King was imploring us to look at and say, the NLF, the Vietnamese, the people of Colombia, the people of Ghana, they are our brothers because they are facing that same enemy, and they are facing those same bullets, those coups, those that oppressed people in the United States are facing, that Black people especially are facing, and that framework is still missing. That's why it's so important, I think, to remember King and remember the movement that he came from. Study that movement, and you can begin with King because he does talk about these things as well. He talks about he was involved in many different struggles, so it's important to get back to that. But anyway, I'll leave it to you guys for the last word. But I do want to say, if you're on Twitter, go to YouTube. And I see 118 viewers right now on Twitter. Go to YouTube, like the stream, like the stream, subscribe, all of that, because that really helps. So go there. We streamed on Twitter late. We had some tech issues, but if you're ever on Twitter and watching these streams, go to YouTube and definitely help us out with likes and shares and subscriptions. But anyway, last word for you guys.
I'll give Ajamu the last word. Ajamu, the inauguration is going to be in a few days. What do you recommend that we watch out for as the Biden administration gets underway? What are you looking at?
I'm looking at whether or not the people who talked about putting his feet to the fire, if there's going to be that kind of response, because it's going to be quite clear that the emergency situation that poor people and working class face in this country will only get worse. And so I'm looking to see what kinds of real policies that they're going to advance, and what would be the response from their supporters to the inadequacies of those policies. Secondly, I'm looking to see if there will be any kind of substantial shift in U.S. foreign policy, in their relationships to nations like Venezuela. What might happen with the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, for example. So these are some of the things we need to look at up front early to see if there, in fact, will be any kind of shift. I don't really see much, but I really implore people to get organized, to understand that the only way there will be changes with the Biden administration and with policies in general is when the people themselves, acting independently, are able to exert sufficient force to force them to address our objective human rights needs.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ajamu, for coming on to the stream today. Thanks for everyone who came through and supported. Of course, definitely subscribe to the channel, join Black Alliance for Peace as a supporter or a member. Look into Black Alliance for Peace, read Black Agenda Report every week. Yeah, blackallianceforpeace.com. Go to the website right now. Because they're doing the real organizing on the ground work that needs to happen even amid this pandemic. Yeah, so it was a great stream. I think we hit on a lot. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy is so important for us to remember, and the movement that really brought him about, and the movement that continued to shape the struggle from here on. And donate to Black Agenda Report too, and to Black Alliance for Peace anywhere you can, because we definitely need the support in this movement to continue this kind of work. So thanks, Margaret, of course, co-host. Appreciate everything, and yeah, John, we'll probably see you again very soon, I'm sure.
Yes, let's do it again. Thanks a lot.
All right, peace, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.